I'd like to welcome you today to the University of Denver. We're going to go ahead and get started. And we're very privileged to have opening us here today our Chancellor, Rebecca Chop. Professor Chop, Chancellor Chop, joined us about 2 years ago now as our Chancellor, our first woman Chancellor. And before coming here, she was president of Swarthmore, of Yale Divinity School, and also of Colgate. So she brings loads of experience to us, and we have already seen some tremendous progress, tremendous shifts in some of the things happening here at our university under her watch, and we are very pleased to have her come and open our proceedings for this conference. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Tamara. Let me begin by saying welcome to the University of Denver for those of you who are on our campus for several days, and to all of those who live on our campus. It's great to have you here too. Tamara is one of the people I go to think about things going on our campus and how we can engage more and more of you. As I look at the title for this conference, the words are so keyed. We have ruptured social systems, not only on this campus, and we do, not only in this country, and we do, but all around the world. People are experiencing trauma. People are desiring trust. People long for peace building. So I'm excited about this conference. I'm pleased about the resources that the University of Denver have in this area. As I look at your conference listing, and as I get to know more and more of the faculty and graduate students and students across the campus, I realize that we have an opportunity. If we can use what we have here, we can address some of the issues on our campus and perhaps model for others. Just a word about what's happening on our campus, and I'm going to keep it very, very brief. Like many campuses across America, the Black Lives Movement really provides the opportunity, if you will, for people to express the pain of trauma, the desire for peace, the demand that things change. Last Friday, I had about 125 students, faculty, and staff come to my office to talk, to bring a list of demands. In a 2-hour-long conversation, I heard about the trauma students experience on this campus and out in the world at large. I heard their optimism in the midst of their pain that they could make a difference. So I guess I just want to say on behalf of all this campus and the country and the world, thank you for what you do. And I hope, because I know you represent many disciplines and colleges and schools, I hope you can knit your resources together and help us all address that optimism and change we need. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Chancellor Chop. So when we open our newspapers, we are faced with salient examples of trauma and the legacies of trauma. Unarmed black men getting shot, Syrian refugees, and day-to-day aggressions and difficult experiences throughout our institutions and our political life. We want to ask, in light of that, how do we still build communities and build peace? And it's the bringing together of those two areas that has led us to develop this conference here today. So, again, I'd like to welcome you here to Denver, to the University of Denver, and to our conference on behalf, first of all, of the sponsoring organizations, Salis World, the Conflict Resolution Institute, and the International Disaster Psychology Program. we would like to tell you a little bit more briefly about what we do, and I will do that in just a moment. But I would like to first dispense with a few details. We would like you to hang on to your name tags throughout the week. And we have water stations instead of bottled water. That's partly a statement about our attempts to do this in a more sustainable way. So I'd also like you to join me in some thank yous. The first thank you goes to our sponsoring institutions and organizations. Again, the Conflict Resolution Institute, Salus World, and the International Disaster Psychology Program, and our hosting schools, the Graduate School of Professional Psychology and the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. I'd also like you to join me in thanking two entities that have given us generously to help this happen. One is the Henry R. Luce Foundation, and the other is an anonymous donor who have given gifts to help make this possible. And finally, I'd like you to join me in thanking people who are probably primarily out of the room, but it's our volunteers and staff who have helped to make this possible. So for those of you that are here, thank you. So again, our Conflict Resolution Institute, I'll just say briefly, is an entity composed of a multidisciplinary master's program and also a center for conflict engagement that engages in work in the community and around the world in both capacity building and conflict resolution. So I will now introduce our two partner organizations through Elaine Hansen and Gwen Vogel-Mitchell, who both have words of welcome as well. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you and welcome this morning to this, the culmination of a lot of work on a lot of people's parts to bring together these disciplines of trauma and conflict resolution. An idea that we came up about 9 years ago with the first conference, that we can't engage in peacekeeping without putting the understanding of trauma and peacekeeping and violence together. So I'm very honored to welcome you here and to have Salus World as being one of the co-sponsors of this conference, which I think is so important. Briefly, Salus World is an international nonprofit headquartered in Denver, which provides global mental health services and specifically targets trauma healing in areas of post-conflict or human rights violations. We go in and we do training on trauma, recognition of trauma to teachers, members of other NGOs, and other organizations around the world who either ask for our help or we move in and organize other NGOs around trauma healing and mental health. So thank you for coming and being here, and I hope to speak with each of you as the conference moves forward. Thank you.
Good morning. On behalf of the International Disaster Psychology Program at GSPP, I'm happy to welcome you to this conference. It seems fitting that Dr. Judith Fox will introduce Dr. Judith Herman, but I've stolen the mic for just a second. The training of our IDP program and the philosophy behind it is grounded in trauma-informed and culturally alert practice. An emphasis on social justice and honoring unique personal narratives and cultural paths is a core element of our field and an important aspect of this conference. It's exciting to co-host a conference with the Conflict Resolution Program at the Corbell School and to further examine the ways our field intersect through a systems lens. I'm so glad we found a way to bring such premier practitioners and theorists to Denver, and I'd like to stop here so we have as much time as possible with our keynotes, our discussants, and each other. Thank you for coming, and I look forward to the next few days.
Good morning, everybody. Is that good? Okay. Don't get too close, okay. I'm Judith Fox. I'm director of our International Disaster Psychology program here at DU. Welcome, everybody. I am so honored to introduce Dr. Judith Herman, whose work has had such an important impact on so many personal and professional lives, as well as on many of the professional fields that are represented here today in our audience. Dr. Herman is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And just a side note, every year I have the opportunity in class to introduce the new graduate students in our program to the field of trauma and lifespan development through Dr. Herman's work, Trauma and Recovery. And every year I so look forward to their pensive and even stunned facial expressions and the discussions that follow after they read the material. Her work continues to have such an important impact every year for many, many people. In this particular book, she masterfully places our understanding of trauma in a multi-systemic and historical context, and the continual articulation of the multiple forces at play in the field of trauma, recovery, and peacebuilding is indeed why we're here today. Through her writing, teaching, and clinical work in the mental health field, Dr. Herman has raised our consciousness to the ways in which our lived experiences and ways of thinking about gender, trauma, and mental health are deeply embedded in the context of our lives. They're influenced by political, economic, social realities that may halt or propel ways we view people affected by trauma and how they view themselves. Her work in the area of gender violence not only instructs us about the oppressive contextual pressures affecting trauma survivors, but also how readily the reality of trauma and oppression is influenced by social systems to go underground, and how we as professionals may or may not contribute to this. Her works beautifully detail the mental health professional's privileged position of providing safety for people to be heard and witnessed, contributing to the possibilities for recovery and moving forward. In speaking with her and reading her autobiographical chapter, it became clear what it was in her own developmental context that contributed to her abilities to speak out for others, relegated to powerless positions. Bravery clearly runs in her family. She was the granddaughter of Jewish immigrants fleeing oppression and the daughter of leftist intellectuals, including a mother who was a psychologist and political activist. Her parents were politically persecuted here in the United States. Further, her own experiences, feminist awakening, and involvement in the women's movement as an activist and leader led her to offer safe spaces to women to tell their stories, and unlike many who came before her, she was prepared to really hear them. While father-daughter incest has been viewed as a rarity before her work in this area revealed an unrecognized, significant prevalence of sexual abuse that resonated with women worldwide. Along with psychologist Mary Harvey, she developed the Victims of Violence program at Cambridge Hospital, where clinical care is offered to survivors of interpersonal violence, training to professionals, and research in the field of trauma is advanced. It's really only fitting that Dr. Herman begins our conference this morning. Her commitment to activism and social justice is really what binds our professions here today. One disclaimer, her bigger-than-life presence, soon to be seen on the Skype screen, is not a reflection of her personality, I don't think. She's very humble, kind, and very approachable. let's think of it instead as illustrating really the tremendous impact of her life's work. Today, she'll speak to us about the meanings of justice to trauma survivors. We'll then have questions at the end. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Herman, and join me in welcoming her.
Let me start by telling you about this justice project that I've been working on off and on for quite some time. It seemed to me as I was speaking with many patients, many survivors, that their own personal healing only took things so far, that at a certain point, when people realized that this wasn't just a personal problem, this was a social problem, they'd want to get involved in some kind of movement for changing the system. So people would get involved in speak outs, or they would get involved in public education or trying to change the laws. Or sometimes people would join together when there were multiple victims of one perpetrator to try to get the justice system to respond. And as we'll talk about in a minute, that just seemed like a very, very heavy lift. And one of the reasons it seemed that so few people got involved trying to actually get our justice institutions to respond was that the responses that justice systems offer, that is to say, in the criminal justice system, punishment of the offender, or in the civil justice system, financial fines and so on the offender, that wasn't really what people were looking for. So I got interested in talking with people more about what they were looking for. And that's the genesis of this project, and it's very much a work in progress. And so I welcome very much your feedback and questions and observations and so on. So let me start by saying this is the work that I've done has been mainly with survivors of gender-based violence, sexual and domestic violence. And I think, though, that this can be a good model for other conflict situations, or people who are in situations emerging from dictatorship or civil war, for that matter, because even in those much more recognized conflict situations, so much of what people suffer with is not what some enemy did to them, but what the people they trusted did or did not do to harm them or to protect them from harm. And so in that sense, gender-based violence makes a perfect model, because you can think of it as an endemic form of violence. It's not an epidemic that comes from outside. It's something built into our society. This is from this statement is from the Fourth World Conference on Women, the one where Hillary Clinton famously said, "Women's rights are human rights," was one of her best moments, I think, on the world stage. Really, I mean, it seems like an obvious observation, but in some ways it wasn't, because the human rights community was all about political violence, and women's rights include the right to personal bodily integrity and safety, and those rights are constantly being violated in a way that people don't remark about until they do. Here's the most recent CDC survey on intimate partner and sexual violence. I should say that until the second wave of the women's movement in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have any such research. And it's only really at the inspiration of the women's movement that these kinds of studies began to be conducted. And what you see in this study, and these numbers really haven't changed very much in 20 years, is that we have about 1 in 5 women suffering rape. That's the criminal justice definition of rape. And about 2% of men. Men are also victims of sexual violence. As you'll see in a minute, there's a disparity, though, a discrepancy between the experiences of women and the experiences of men. Stalking, about 15% versus 6%, and intimate partner violence. Here, actually, the numbers for women in this study are about what we've been finding in studies for the last 20 or 30 years. The figure for men is a little bit high, interesting, but again, just to call your attention to the fact that men can be victims as well as women, and sometimes there's that extra measure of shame attached to men's experiences of victimization that make it even harder for men sometimes to speak out. This is from an earlier study, the National Violence Against Women survey, which was done in the 1990s. But as I say, the percentages seem to be about steady. There haven't been major changes in the last 20 or 30 years. So as you can see, women's experiences of violence and men's experiences of assault, particularly, but even sexual assault, are quite different in the sense that women are likely to be victimized, most likely to be victimized by someone they know very well, an intimate partner, a relative, an acquaintance, and only very rarely is a stranger attack the experience, the model experience of women. Whereas for men, we're talking here in this particular slide, we're looking at physical assault as well as sexual assault. The most likely attacker is a stranger or an acquaintance, much more rarely a relative or an intimate partner. And what that means is that for men, most experiences of violence are unlikely to be repeated. Because if you get into a fight in a bar with a stranger, unless you are both frequenters of that same bar, in which case you're acquaintances, it's unlikely that you're going to be attacked by this same person again. And you have a safe place to retreat to, where the people you trust most are not going to harm you. Whereas for women, the experiences of assault are mainly people who are trusted, people who are close, family, and that means that the violence is very likely to be repeated because these are relationships that are not easily broken off. In the case of child victims, if you're under the control of the perpetrator, you have nowhere else to go. And with intimate partners, oftentimes, similarly, the violence is embedded in a whole system of coercive control, so that it's very difficult to escape. And that has a whole emotional impact that is much more profound than that of a single impact trauma. The other thing that I want to emphasize about the women's experiences of violence is that they begin very early in life. As you see, and this is again from the National Violence Against Women survey in the 1990s, most rapes are carried out against very young women or children. The good news in this slide is that if you make it to 25 without having been raped, your chances of escaping this particular kind of gender-based violence go way up. But I find this slide continually shocking, that most victims are children and adolescents or young adults. And this too has a profound impact on development, because people who develop, who grow up in a climate of terror, have a very difficult time dealing with all the developmental challenges that that we face as we grow up, and that has a profound effect on the developing personality. I'm not going to go into clinical details on the impact of trauma today. That's not really my focus. Let me just assure you that it is profound, and that the work of recovery is hard work. It can be done, and it's very inspiring work as a therapist, to be a witness and advocate for survivors, because you see so much courage, you see so much creativity in the hard work that survivors do to master the trauma and to get to a place where the trauma is just one thing that happened in life rather than the thing that shapes your whole existence. But lest we doubt that this is still a widespread problem, we have a most recent consciousness-raising experience as part of our bizarre election campaign that features reactions to the most recent revelation about Donald Trump's predatory behavior toward women. And one of the things that has apparently happened as a result of the widespread media attention to Mr. Trump's boast about grabbing women by the pussy is that a writer named Kelly Oxford got on Twitter and said, "Women, tweet me your first assaults," and she goes first. This happened last Friday, that she put this out on Twitter, And over the weekend, she got something like 27 million responses. So lest one doubt that this is a current problem, I thought I might just present that. And then we get to the problem of impunity, also illustrated in our election campaign, because it's bad enough to feel that one is constantly at risk of some kind of either minor or major bodily violation. But the fact that people can brag about it and joke about it and think it's funny or think it's no big deal is like a constant reminder to women of our subordinate status, that to the extent that it's open season on us, it reminds us constantly that we are less than. And I also think of that as simply an example of what all subordinated groups experience in terms of the impunity that goes along with being the dominant or the superordinate social group. Again, I think thanks to the women's movement, we now have at the United Nations a special rapporteur on human rights that looks at violence against women in all countries. And about now, 15 years ago, on International Women's Day, the special rapporteurs on women's rights came out with this declaration talking about the climate of impunity that surrounds this kind of violence. And so, they urge states to end impunity, bring perpetrators to justice. Okay, easier said than done, because the system that we have now, at least for criminal justice, simply is not up to the task. First of all, because of the shame that surrounds gender-based violence, most victims don't come forward. They are rightly understand that they're likely to be shamed and blamed and ostracized for speaking out. And so most victims don't. Most victims don't tell. And that's even now with sexual assault, we're up to maybe a third of cases get reported to police. And I actually think that these are numbers from the 1990s, but I don't think we've gotten much better on this. Maybe 1 in 3 women comes forward. I actually think it's probably lower than that. But let's assume for the moment that we at least start off with 1 in 3 women reporting. What happens then in the criminal justice system is that less than half of those cases will result in an arrest. And of those, then you have a further attrition where prosecutors decline to prosecute because most of these are quote unquote he said, she said situations where there are no witnesses, And if there is DNA evidence, I mean, oftentimes there isn't, because oftentimes there's delayed disclosure. The victim didn't go right to an emergency room and get a rape kit done. And only later kind of realizes that, yeah, what happened to her was rape. But if there is DNA evidence, then the defense is going to claim consent. I think we have a case like that going on with a famous sports performer, and then again, it's his word against hers, and women's motives can always be impugned. They're looking for revenge. They're looking for money, and so you can imagine why most women don't want to go through this. The conviction rate of those prosecuted is maybe a little better than 50%. And then of those convicted, we get to those sentenced to a prison term, and you're looking at under 5% of the universe of cases. Well, those odds are not great for victims, and so you can understand why most victims don't want to go through this. I just to summarize this, I kind of formulated the contrast between what victims need and what the justice system requires. And so victims, of course, need a greater sense of safety and protection, and the justice system is all about exposure and risk. Victims need acknowledgement. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Validation, a sense that other people believe what she or he is telling. But we have an adversarial system in which the credibility of the victim is going to be on trial, and the victims are often going to feel that they are really the people who are on trial. Victims need a sense of dignity to be treated. They've been horribly humiliated by the violence itself. Remember, in particular, sexual violence, there's no personal gain for the perpetrator other than the pleasure of having someone completely subordinated to his will. And there's something inherently, because I think there's something in us that inherently wishes for the respect and a sense of care and belonging to our social group, to be treated as an object by a respected member of our social group is profoundly shaming. So in the aftermath, victims need a sense of respect and dignity, and the court is set up for humiliation. The defense attorney is going to have to go after the character of the victim as a way of that's how our adversarial system works. Victims need a sense of power and control in their lives, and the justice system offers a complicated set of rules and procedures that are absolutely outside of the control of the victim. Victims need a sense that when they are ready, they can share a personal narrative. They can make They can share their stories with others who are empathetic and understanding. And in the courtroom, victims will discover that they're not there to tell their stories or give their narrative. They're there to answer questions, yes or no. And so the narrative is constantly interrupted and broken off. And, the victim is less sort of spluttering and saying, but no, it wasn't that way at all. Finally, until victims are ready, they tend to avoid reminders of the trauma. And in the courtroom, this is our system. The victim must confront the perpetrator. This is, a system that we have evolved in order to protect defendants against the abuse of power by the state. But we have no similar protections for victims, or quote unquote alleged victims, in the courtroom. So just to quote one of the subjects I interviewed in this pilot study I did over 10 years ago, and I'll tell you a little more about the study in a minute. She said this was somebody who was a victim of domestic violence, and she finally got herself out of the situation, but she wanted a restraining order, and a stay away order, and she wanted it made permanent. So this was not even a criminal matter. This was a civil matter, but where standards of evidence are not quite so rigorous. But nevertheless, this is what she had to say. Basically, you better learn not to take things too seriously, too personally. Her point was that, and I think this was something that many of my informants told me, what was most shocking to her was to realize that she was kind of marginal in the justice procedures. She thought that this was going to be about her, but it wasn't. It was all about the defendant, and she was merely a witness. And that sort of sidelined role was something very hard for her to get used to. So she said, basically, her conclusion was, for your own peace of mind, be prepared to throw your illusions of justice out the window. A very cynical statement, but unfortunately, this is not at all atypical from what I have heard from people who have gone through the justice system. I think partly as an alternative to the kind of system that I just described, we have now the restorative justice movement that claims to focus, to be, and I think has the potential to be more compatible with what victims are looking for, because the focus is on the harm done rather than on the laws broken. The victim and the community are supposedly in control of the process rather than the state. The process is consensus rather than adversarial. And the remedy is restitution, which is often much more in keeping with what victims are looking for, rather than punishment. And And supposedly the victim is central rather than marginalized, but it's that last claim that I take some issue with. And that is because I think the restorative justice movement did really come out of work with offenders and the wish, particularly with juvenile offenders, but with offenders in general, to have a less punitive process for offenders. And so it was only sort of later in the game, and some of the most important theorists of restorative justice will acknowledge this, that the role of victims became important. And I think oftentimes in restorative justice processes, there will be victims will experience a kind of an agenda of forgiveness that is, again, not the victim's agenda, or not necessarily the victim's agenda. And so while I think that the restorative justice models have a great deal of potential for a kind of a better way to address endemic violence, I caution, that's my word of caution is about the offender focus and the advocacy for offenders that often takes priority over the advocacy for victims. Actually, one of the internationally recognized models of restorative justice, the process that went on in South Africa after the transition to a majority rule government from the apartheid regime. In many ways, victims were made central in that process. Excuse me, I'm going to have to get a cough drop or something. I thought what was one of the most brilliant things about the South African model was that the victims got to testify on, they had hearings where victims came to testify, and that was all that went on. The perpetrators were not there. There was no, the confrontation with the perpetrator did not take place. It was simply a place to hear the victims' stories and allow the victims to come forward. And those hearings were broadcast throughout the country on radio and TV. And I thought that was a way of making the victim story central and a way of focusing on healing victims that was a breakthrough in our thinkings about restorative justice. My criticism has to do with the agenda of forgiveness that I think did not come out of the victims' testimonies, but out of the agenda of peacemaking that led to a more or less peaceful transition from a dictatorship to a democratic system. So let me tell you a little more about my study. I decided that I just wanted to hear from survivors of sexual and domestic violence what justice would look like if they were in charge, if they could just imagine, let their imagination run free. What would be fair? What would be right? What would make things right? And so this was not a random sample study. This was a convenient sample. I just kind of put out the word to victim advocates and therapists and colleagues that I knew that I was interested in interviewing survivors, and were there any people who would like to come and talk to me? We did not recruit patients from our program or any others because that's the imposition of an agenda on a patient for a therapist to say, by the way, would you like to participate in a study? That's a kind of a dual role for the therapist. And so we wanted people who were not necessarily in any kind of healing relationship with us. And I ended up with 22 survivors. I interviewed them in depth and transcribed the interviews. There were 4 men and 18 women. I would say my sample was pretty diverse in terms of class background and ethnic and quote unquote racial background. But I don't think it was a diverse sample in terms of educational level. These were most of the people in my study had at least a college degree, and also most of the people in my study, if they had attempted to make use of the justice system, their cases had been resolved one way or another. About half of my informants had made a complaint in the criminal justice system. About half of them, some overlapping, had also made a civil complaint, either for a restraining order or for damages. And a minority, but I would say about 10, had also tried informally to try to work something out with the perpetrator. And I would say that most people who either tried to work things out privately or tried to use the mechanisms of the state were disappointed with the results. On the other hand, they all felt that they'd really learned something and they weren't sorry that they'd done it. That they had come out the other side of it stronger and wiser, though not necessarily, but not satisfied in terms of their ideas of what would have been a just outcome. I think maybe there were criminal convictions in 4 cases, and actually 3 of the 4 people who were convicted were sentenced to a prison term. So 3 out of 22. Again, it's not a high percentage. Here's what my informants told me about what they thought was most important to them. Number one, and there was pretty much uniform consensus on this, I would say 90-some%, said what they wanted was acknowledgement. They wanted acknowledgement that this happened. And they wanted it not necessarily just from the perpetrator, or maybe not even from the perpetrator. They wanted it from the people that mattered to them. their families, their communities. And so right away, what I was starting to notice with this consensus was that the community was much more important to the survivors than the perpetrator. The perpetrator might or might not acknowledge the facts. He might, keep insisting, or he might acknowledge the facts, but say, what's the big deal? Why is she whining about this now? But as one informant said, the reason I want him to admit it is that I think that's the only way that my family will believe it, is if it comes from him, because they don't believe it when it comes from me. And so the acknowledgement, the recognition that this happened, and then the recognition that this happened and it was wrong. It was not, it wasn't right. You would think that that would be a bare minimum of what people wanted, but it turned out to be incredibly important. And that, I think, is what I learned from that, is that this particular form of subordination, gender-based violence, because it's so endemic, because it's so secret, it isolates the victim. It shames the victim. It makes the victim feel that not only that he or she can be treated as an object, but that the community permits it. The community enables it. The bystanders don't care. And actually, going way back to the Holocaust testimonies, we learned this, I guess we have to learn this over and over, because the Holocaust survivors again would say, where was the rest of the world? This was known. Why did people sit back and allow this to happen? And of course, we're hearing this. We hear this over and over with trauma survivors. We're hearing it now from the Syrian refugees. We heard this in Rwanda. We heard this in Bosnia. Where was the world? Sitting back, allowing this to happen. So acknowledgement by the community, vindication by the community, is a way of bringing survivors out of isolation, and that's why these three things are so important and really up there at the top of the list for survivors. Then we come to things that didn't have that many, and maybe even most survivors named as part of their vision of justice, but didn't have that, absolute majority consensus. Apology. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But, again, apology from the perpetrator or apology from the community. Sometimes it was both. Fair restitution, we'll talk about that, and prevention of future harm. That was a big one. Very few people talked about punishment, even though the interview that I did really pulled for vengeful thoughts, punitive thoughts, fantasies. I just wasn't. It just wasn't what was most on most people's radar. What they, to the extent that they wanted the offender punished, it was mainly for the purpose of preventing the perpetrator from harming other people. And oftentimes, what that meant was just exposure and containment. That is to say, letting the community know this is the kind of person this is what he does, look out. But as I'll talk about more in a minute, punishment and revenge were just way down on the list, and so was forgiveness. So that, if you will, the extremes of, on the one hand, vengeance, on the other hand, forgiveness, didn't seem to be what most people were thinking about. So let me share a few quotes. This was, I think, a very typical statement. I just want people to know who he is, what he did to me. This is what he did to another human being. And so, if you will, the human rights vision is implicit, I think, in this statement that, no, this is somebody who violated me as a human being, and that's wrong. Vindication is an interesting word. I had thought that it came from it meant something that came from the same root as the word vindictive, but it turns out that's not true. That what vindication means is to be set free. But it's a particular kind of being set free, and that is to be set free from unfair suspicion, from the burden of doubt, from basically being judged, unfairly judged by the community. And so here's a quote from Ross Chait, who is a law professor at Brown, and who also, because it was too late for a statute of limitations had run out for a criminal complaint, initiated a civil action against the director of a boys' choir that he'd been part of when he was a kid, who was a serial perpetrator, a pedophile that preferred boy victims, and who won his case. And what Professor Chait said to me is that what the money meant to him was that, because he knew he was never actually going to get the money, that the judge thought that what happened to him was important, that it mattered. And so acknowledgement of harm, he said, that was the day the system acknowledged the harm to me. And that meant a lot to him. So here's the magic thing about apology. And this is somebody who went in a heartbeat from talking about her vengeful fantasies to imagining what an apology would mean to her. And what it would mean was that she would be relieved of her hateful feelings. And oftentimes when when survivors talk to me about their vengeful feelings, they describe them as a kind of foreign body. That's something these were feelings that they wish they didn't have, that they felt in some ways had been imposed on them by the perpetrator, that they bore the legacy of the trauma in hateful feelings, that conflicted with their own view of themselves as a decent person. So she imagined this apology, and she says, "Thank you, God, because then the hate would go away." And it is rare, but occasionally survivors do confront perpetrators and sometimes they will initiate a confrontation with a perpetrator, and they will actually receive a genuine apology. As I say, it's very rare, but it's amazing when it happens, because a heartfelt apology spontaneously seems to generate a forgiveness response. And there's a kind of, it's as though that's the reconnecting on a human level, on an equal level, on a level of respect that is so important to survivors. So when it happens, it's a wonderful thing. On the other hand, there's the problem of the insincere apology. And again, we're all very familiar with this from the political realm. This is the politicians. I'm very sorry if anyone was offended. If somebody was such a wuss that they couldn't take a joke, and they're whining about this now. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So the insincere apology just rubs salt in the wound. And so that's another reason why victims don't necessarily want to seek it. But here's another survivor saying he wouldn't really apologize in the sense of true remorse. An apology based on empathy for the victim, understanding what the victim feels. And she said, I would feel slimed all over again, but if he did apologize, I would feel the pressure to forgive, because there is this kind of expectation that apology leads to forgiveness, kind of forgetting that the sincere apology thing is really what leads to genuine forgiveness. Here's someone who really talks about her wish for the community to be ashamed and to be sorry. She says it has so little to do with him, because where was everybody watching me fall apart as a teenager and not asking any questions, not saying anything, nothing, So again, the wish for the bystanders to be accountable was a big part of what I heard in the testimonies from my informants. So let's talk a little bit about some models of accountability, because in the political realm, the closest we've gotten to it again was the Truth and Reconciliation process, in which, for once, there was no blanket amnesty. The agreement, the peace agreement was, what was negotiated was that amnesty would be conditional on full confession. And so again, the validation of the survivor's reality was made the most important thing that the perpetrators could do. And if they did make a full confession, then no, the option of any kind of prosecution was taken off the table. And that was a big advance over the kinds of blanket impunity that we saw with some of the Latin American dictatorships, for example, at least in the initial decades, shall we say. But other than that, there was no restitution. There was no, perpetrators for the most part went free, and they had to confess, but they didn't have to be sorry, and they didn't have to make any kind of amends. I think in some of the models that have developed out of people who work with sexual and domestic violence, we have some interesting thoughts about what accountability looks like. One thing that I think is important in the U.S. And actually came out of a reactionary government where the emphasis was on, being harsh on crime. But one good amends model was developed by the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, in 1984 in the U.S. And I often, when I talk to international groups, I talk about this as a model that I think is worth copying in other communities, because in other countries, because what this model says is that we're going to set up a fund for victims, and the people who are going to contribute to the funds are perpetrators. And so, unlike in an individual civil action where you can sue your perpetrator for damages, but whether you receive any damages may depend on whether the perpetrator has any money, and that's just kind of random. What if we have a fund that's going to benefit victims, and perpetrators have to contribute to that fund, and out of the victim, and victims are going to sit on the boards and have a voice in how those funds are distributed. I think that's a very progressive model, and many states have instituted. Here in Massachusetts, we have the Massachusetts Office of Victim Assistance, and offenders on a state level rather than federal level will contribute to the fund. And the fund goes to pay victim compensation for injuries or loss of time from work, or psychotherapy, medical bills. It also pays for victim services, including rape crisis centers, battered women's shelters. Our program at the Victims of Violence program has for years been a recipient of VOCA funding, and we have because of that funding, we have hospital-based advocates that actually can work with doctors who, because oftentimes, for example, battered women will disclose to their physician. That may be the only person they can disclose to. The physician doesn't really know, okay, what do we do next? But if there's a victim advocate right there in the hospital, she can help walk the victim through how to get services, how to use the justice system that's so alien, how to have a buddy going through it so she doesn't have to be so intimidated. And we also have, because of our VOCA funding, we have a homicide bereavement service for survivors of family members who've been murdered. That is to say, family members who have had a loved one murdered and who are struggling with their own recovery. So it's a fund that can be used very creatively, and victims feel good when they realize that this isn't just a general taxpayer money that's coming to help them. It's money that offenders have had to contribute, and it feels right. It feels fair. Then we have developed, particularly, I think, coming out of more of a restorative justice model, some court diversion programs. This one, developed by the psychologist Mary Koss at the University of Arizona, was really devised in the hope of being a way to address rape on college campuses. But it involved an enormous amount of community organizing, because everybody had to get on board: the local DA, the local police, the Rape Crisis Center, the campus advocates. And what they came up with was a diversion model. Again, in some ways similar to the South Africa model. The perpetrator has to confess. The perpetrator has to plead guilty to the offense. But if that happens, and I should say, before this is even offered to the perpetrator, it's offered to the victim, and the victim has to say, okay, I'm willing to go this other route. If the victim agrees and the perpetrator agrees, and there's a system I don't quite understand where if this process fails and then they're going to go through a regular court process. So the guilty plea is a kind of conditional guilty plea, because if this process falls apart, then they do have to go to court. But the power of the court is behind this, and without that, you don't get the motivation for the perpetrator, or responsible person, as it's called in this model, to participate. If both victim and responsible person agree, then there's a lot of work with both parties and their supporters. So the perpetrator brings family members or friends or buddies or frat brothers or whoever, and so does the victim similarly. And they prepare for a conference, and in the conference, the victim gives an impact statement and proposes what reparative actions are important to her or him. And then if there's an agreement, then the agreement is monitored for a year to see if the responsible person lives up to the agreement. And if at the end of the year, all the conditions have been met, then the perpetrator writes what's called a letter of reflection and clarification, a formal written apology, but hopefully a real apology. That is to say, an apology based on some kind of empathic understanding of the victim's suffering, rather than, I'm really sorry I got caught, which is usually the first kind of I'm sorry that the perpetrator is willing to offer. So this is a diversion model that ran for several years. There are some outcome studies. Interestingly enough, I think most of the people who ended up going through this model were people who pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor, not a felony. There weren't a lot of actual rape cases, a lot more of what we might call sexual, sort of second-degree sexual assault, the kind of groping and grabbing that we heard about from Mr. Trump so recently, and also non-contact offenses like exhibitionists. But the people, for most of the victims and offenders who went through the process, there was they felt positive about what they had been through, which is a very different kind of statement from what I got in my study. So that's an interesting model to think about. And then we have the kinds of we have a lot of diversion models for intimate partner violence for batterers, mainly using a curriculum from what's called the Duluth model, again, a group of both victim advocates, advocates in battered women's shelters, and people who work with batterers. It's a kind of a manual, if you will, for how to work with batterers. And again, it has to be a court diversion program, because without the backup of the court saying, you know, if you don't do it this way, it's going to be a lot tougher. They just get dropouts, and everything goes back to the way it was before. But so these are group treatment programs for batterers, and they come at it from a feminist social analysis that says violence is a choice. That you don't just go out randomly hitting people on the street. You do this behind closed doors, and you do it with the assumption of impunity. And now we're changing the social structure that allowed impunity up until now. So violence is a choice, and emphasizing the accountability of the perpetrator, so that if he says, well, but she, stop right there. Whatever she did, she doesn't deserve to get beaten. Yeah, but she mouthed off on me, and she was, basically she got uppity, right? She asserted herself in, he made his wishes known, he made his will known, and she didn't comply. So the answer is no. Whatever it is that she did, even if she hurt your feelings, even if she made you angry, you don't have the right to hit her. The batterer treatment program is always in the therapists in the program are always they have permission to be in communication with the victim or the victim's advocates or therapists to make sure that whatever the safety plan that has been agreed to is being honored, and that they are feeling safe. And then some skills training and stopping violence. Okay, if you're angry and you're, basically timeout, kind of, this is what you do with an angry toddler, right? You say, okay, you can go to your room and you can have your tantrum. And then when you're ready to come out and be part of the, the social world again, you can come out. So breathing techniques, walking away, whatever the behavioral skills that are needed. And the other thing that's really useful about the group model is that the members are so tuned into one another. They get the rationalizations and the excuses because they've done it themselves, but they can see it so clearly in others. And there's something about being confronted by your peers that, it's one thing even to have an authority figure, a judge, say, no, violence is not okay. Yeah. We all know you have to say that. But when your peers say it, it's different. It has a different valence. It's kind of like, instead of your peers in the bar or in the gym or, in the locker room saying, kind of thinking it's funny or thinking it's okay or helping you with your rationalizations, they're calling you out. And that's a new experience. As I say, these programs have been implemented in a number of countries. John Braithwaite, who's one of the major theorists of restorative justice, talks about the major process for offenders as being what he calls reintegrative shaming. That is to say, not the kind of shaming that's done to the victim, which ostracizes the victim and makes the victim feel isolated and disgusting. The shaming is about helping the person feel that he's done something wrong, but also at the same time feel like, yeah, his buddies get it. And his buddies are not trying to kick him out of the group. His buddies want him to be part of the group, but in a different model of manhood, in a model of manhood that takes pride in being nonviolent. Here's some outcome data. This was a study done in the US at 4 different sites, looking at the number of recurrences of assault as batterers were sort of participating in these groups. And what you see is that reassault or threat of reassault did happen. That was not a reason to kick the perpetrator out of the group necessarily, as long as a new safety plan could be devised where, again, where the victim could feel protected. And it might have been, so it might involve temporary separation of the couple, for example. Not with the idea that it's going to be permanent necessarily, but with the idea of right now you don't have enough control over your behavior, and so you need to be out of the house. But by 9 months, it was down to 4% reassault, and then there was a little plateau, and by 2 years, it was down to maybe 1%. So in terms of effectiveness, this looks a lot better than the usual court process. Here's another study. This one, I believe, was done in the UK. And this was one where the outcomes were measured by the testimony of the victims. The treatment group was compared with a group that went through sort of court procedures as usual. And this was, I think, women who had come in for restraining orders. Does the perpetrator take responsibility for his actions? Over 50% said it was better. Does he show respect for you? about 50% said better. So there's not a magic cure by any means, but 50% looks a lot better than treatment as usual. Does he understand your feelings and show interest in your feelings? Does he get what you're feeling? Yeah, over 50% said yes. Over 50% said, yes, he can understand my point of view. And this last one I thought was in some ways the best outcome measure of all. The couple can have a laugh together. In order to have a laugh with your former perpetrator, you have to feel pretty safe with him. You have to feel safe enough to be at ease and to actually feel pleasure and enjoyment. And that's, now here's the comparison group. Most said things were worse. About 20% said things were improved, but a much larger number said things were worse. So again, I think this model has a lot of promise, and I don't think it's applicable just to domestic violence. I think it can be used in a lot of circumstances where court diversion and safety planning for victims is part of is part of what needs to happen. So let me talk finally a little bit about the things that seem least important to my informants. And I want to start off with a wonderful quote from George Orwell. Revenge is sour. Such a wonderful contrast with the usual revenge is sweet. And he really understands the psychology here. This is somebody who, if probably most of you had to read 1984 in high school. I think that's still being assigned. And from that, you can really understand you can get how much he understands the psychology of victims. But he says revenge is something you fantasize about when you're powerless, when you're humiliated, when you're so isolated and ashamed. People who are isolated and ashamed feel rage. I mean, they feel shame about, my mother, the psychologist, was one of the early researchers who studied shame, and a clinician as well. And she talked about shame spirals, that people who are ashamed feel shame about being ashamed. Why am I still, why haven't I gotten over this already? And everybody says, just let it go. And, but I can't let it go. Why can't I let it go? So a spiral of shame and then more shame. And she also talked about shame rage spirals, that helplessness fuels fantasies of retaliation. I just want to put his eyes out so he doesn't have to, he won't have that smirk on his face anymore. A lot of my survivors talked about that what would be justice for them is coming to a family event and being able to hold their head up high and have the perpetrator be the one who had to look down and be ashamed. So it's a fantasy of being more powerful than the perpetrator and having power over and having the perpetrator be subordinated. And he talks, of course, about the World War II model. When the thing becomes possible, he says it's merely pathetic and disgusting. And that is what my survivors told me. This is a work of art by a rape victim named Amy Bradford, who was an art student and who was raped by one of the men who was a fellow student at an art class she was taking. and who she started dating. So she has all these fantasies of shooting him. You see the perpetrator, somebody with his fly open and his penis hanging out, but his head bowed and blood coming out of his heart. She's just shot him. She portrays herself as still naked, still bleeding, still an object of, still screaming, basically, and still desperate. But then, in the middle of the canvas, she shows someone crying, and that's another self-portrait, crying over all the violence in the world, and the little snapshots behind the main figures in the artwork, in the painting, are photos of all the people who had died from gun violence in Boston that year. And she, I'm reproducing her her painting by permission. I don't have permission to distribute the artwork. For those of you who might, and sometimes people say, that's just such an amazing piece of artwork, can I copy it? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, that I don't have a release for that. But I also do have her testimony. She said, I was fantasizing about all these ugly things, and she says it disturbed me. These things that disturb me to think about, I feel guilty for wishing someone ill. So again, like the testimony I showed you earlier, this is somebody who feels almost as though her revenge fantasies are like a foreign body in her emotional life, and she doesn't want to have them, and she doesn't she doesn't believe that they're worth acting on. That's not something that she's proud of. On the contrary, she feels guilty. And though she doesn't use the S word, I think she also feels shame. But here's the problem of forgiveness. And here's again from a South African author, Gillian Sloville, who wrote an essay questioning truth and with the question mark, truth and reconciliation, kind of reflecting on what that process had been like in her country. And she says, one of the problems is that the people we are being asked to forgive don't get it. They may have acknowledged what they've done, but they don't get the harm that they've done. And so it feels like making the victims do all the work because they're not receiving a genuine apology. This is Reverend Martin, the Archbishop of Dublin, talking again about the forgiveness problem. And this was in the aftermath of the pedophilia scandal that came to light first here in Boston, and then I hope all of you have seen the Spotlight, the movie that talks about the the process in the Boston Globe that led to the first major news story on the endemic pedophilia within the Catholic Church, and now, of course, it's been demonstrated in many countries and several continents, in fact. So Reverend Martin talks about how the insult, the hurt that the survivors tell him about is the lack of remorse on the part of offenders, and he kind of gets it that. And I think as a Christian, I think that's very important that he gets that forgiveness true forgiveness is contingent on true apology, and that when many Christians think about forgiveness, they think about kind of letting go of their revenge fantasies, letting go of their bitterness, letting go of their wish for justice, and simply, without any quid pro quo, deciding as an act of will to forgive. But true forgiveness is not an act of will. It's an upwelling of emotion that is beautiful when you see it, but it's a different animal from an act of will. Here's Mary Margaret Giannini, another of my informants, talking about, and this is someone who went to court and actually filed a criminal complaint, and that did result in a conviction and a prison sentence. And she did receive a phony apology and was enraged when she discovered that at the same time that he was apologizing in order to get, probably a lesser sentence, he was appealing the conviction. So she says, I don't think reconciliation will ever happen. And he says, I don't think it needs to happen. In other words, he is not the central, what happens to him is not that of central importance in her life. She says he needs his Creator's forgiveness. This is a very religious person. She says, thank goodness I have no control over that. I don't want to be part of his recovery process. I've had enough work to do on my own. And I thought that was a very sophisticated way of detaching herself from the fate of, detaching her fate from the fate of the perpetrator. Mary Walsh, on the other hand, talked about a different kind of forgiveness, the act of will kind of forgiveness. And her definition, I thought, was brilliant. She said, forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. And it's, at first you don't, it seems kind of trivial, and then I think it seems profound. At least so that was my reaction. So here's a quote from another of my informants, Reverend Anne Marie Hunter, who's a survivor of domestic violence and has now done a lot of work in faith communities dealing with domestic violence. And so she talks about, rather than moving victims to forgiveness, let's think about moving perpetrators to contrition and changed behavior. And I thought that was a nice priority. So I'll close with a graphic that I got from National Crime Victims' Rights Week back in 2002, where the stripes of the flag are all the things that matter in bringing justice to victims: support, voice, choices, counsel, participation, advocacy. But what really, restitution, safety, all of those things, but honor to victims is really, it seemed, what my informants were talking about, that they felt dishonored by the crime in the sense of isolated from their communities, and they wanted their honor restored by the community, by the validation and vindication of the victim, survivor, and accountability, holding the perpetrator accountable, and also a recognition of the community's responsibility to do that as part of their restitution to the victim. So let me close here, and the floor is open for comments and questions and speeches from the floor, whatever moves you.
Deeply textured presentation. I'm talking in here. Thank you very much. Oh, I see. So what we'd like to do, we have 15 minutes for questions, and if people would like to come up here to ask a question, that would be great. Use the microphone. Dr. Herman can see you this way on the screen. So please come on up, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Herman. I'm Donna Minter from Minneapolis. And my question is, as I've been thinking about this work and teaching about it in Minneapolis, I've come to believe that justice is a basic human need. And would you agree with that? That justice is a basic human need. In fact, I often think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I change that graphic and go, okay, there's some truth to this. This makes sense. But at the bottom really needs to be justice, fairness, and cooperation for all those other needs, all those other things for us to aspire to. Does that fit with your way of thinking? That justice
Absolutely.
is... Okay.
Absolutely, yes. Especially when you list those three things together: justice, fairness, and cooperation, because we're social beings. We belonging to a social group is absolutely a basic human need. And part of belonging is the sense that we are valued, we're respected, we are treated fairly, that issues of that decisions are made by a negotiation.
Yeah.
As equal parties.
Right.
And the fundamental injustice is when you subordinate another person, when you treat that person as less than.
Right.
When you treat that person as an object to be used for your pleasure without consulting that person's wishes, then you are saying, you don't matter. You're not part of this community. Right. I matter. I call the shots, and I can do whatever I want with you. Right. And whether you, and that's true, whether you're talking about the most extreme examples of, slavery and human trafficking, whether you're talking about torture and prisoner of war camps, whether you're talking about the kinds of human rights violations that go on in families, right. Or among peers. And so I do think that there is that there's some innate human need to for fairness and to be treated that, in other words, to be treated as part of one's social community, as a valued member of that community, and for that we need fairness.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Does that fit with what you're?
Yes, absolutely. And then the other thing that I think of out of that is the idea of reciprocity. That because
Yes.
basic justice is a basic human need, then out of that, the way to get to justice is reciprocity. That there has to be this when you know, in any interpersonal relationship that has
Right.
been, whether it's been violent or it's been okay. I mean, that there's not violence involved. That reciprocity is really the exchange to get to fairness and justice. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
Okay.
You need some kind of mutual empathy, some kind of mutual respect, so you can reciprocate.
Right.
You can negotiate. You can treat one another as equally respected members of the community.
Great. Thank you.
Tamara, did you have a question?
Hello, I'm Tamara Pearson-Destray from the Conflict Resolution Institute here at the University of Denver. So I actually have two questions. I work in
Sure.
intergroup relations and peacebuilding. And so one of the things I found very interesting was the batterer intervention model with a focus on changing violent men. And so if we take this to the intergroup relationship level, the analog seems to be that we would need to look at how to disrupt our norms of violence. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on how that might happen. And then the second question is that in many situations of intractable, deep-rooted, ongoing conflict, people may oftentimes be both victims and perpetrators. And how does that complicate these kinds of models? Thank you.
Yes. Well, let me talk about the second question first. The way victims may also become perpetrators, and we see that, of course, most graphically with child soldiers who are recruited and made to commit atrocities as once they are taken from their families, the military or paramilitary group becomes their social group, and in order to belong, they must commit atrocities. What we have found with perpetrators who have been coerced in this way is that from their point of view, the coercion is not really an excuse, because they always felt that there was another choice they could have made, and the choice would be to be killed or to kill themselves. And so what we found with people who are acknowledging the atrocities that they've committed under duress is that making amends becomes incredibly important. And actually, one of the things we're also noticing now, I think this also applies to soldiers who commit atrocities as young adults. We're finding, for example, there's been a long-term prospective study called the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study that looks at, the fate of returning Vietnam vets, and what the researchers have found is that the group with the most intractable PTSD are what they call the harmers, the people. It's in about 10% of the group who either harmed civilians or prisoners. They have the worst PTSD and the most intractable PTSD. And we're finding that, again, that people who've committed atrocities need to atone. They need to feel that there is some way they can never make it right, but they can in some ways dedicate themselves to trying to make amends. And so, the work with perpetrators is still very much in its infancy, but that seems to be becoming more clear. And we also now see the legacy of what will happen to the torturers from the CIA black sites and in Iraq and Afghanistan. How to get perpetrators into the kind of diversion, if you will, on the level of protracted civil war or dictatorship, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I mean, in the end, it's a power struggle. I mean, you have to have a peace treaty first. And what's going to be in that peace treaty kind of depends on what your negotiating position is at the cessation of hostilities. I don't know a way around that. I wish I did.
Hi, Dr. Herman. Thanks so much for your talk today. It's really an honor to hear you. I've cited you quite extensively in my own research, and I'm kind of, fangirling out a little bit right now. My name is Holly Guthrie, and I'm at Uppsala University in Sweden. I had a hopefully kind of quick question. So I just wanted a little, I guess a bit more clarification on, you had spoken about the Duluth model, about the battering issues, and I know it said on the slides something about how it had been also used in various different cultures and that. And I wondered if you could speak a bit more about, if you have knowledge on this, of how this has been adapted to different sort of cultural contexts and different settings. I'm thinking particularly about context where sort of social structures or where domestic violence is extremely prevalent, and then you have social structures that are kind of reinforcing the ability for domestic violence to take place. For example, Solomon Islands, which is a place that I've worked in the past, where you have this widespread poverty, and also so in many cases women are really they don't have any other option but to stay with the partner that's battering them. And anyway, I just wonder if you can talk a bit more about again sort of exporting that model and how that adaptation could occur. Thanks.
Well, I really should, I'll say a little bit about it, but I think really I should defer to the experts who are there in Duluth. And, if you just type in a Duluth model on your browser, you'll get lots of information and lots of publications, including more recent ones than the ones I've cited. Again, it is a diversion model, which means you have to have buy-in from the court. That is to say, you have to have some arm of the state at least paying lip service to the idea that violence, that it's not okay to beat your wife. You have to have some laws that say it's not okay. And a lot of what we did very early on in the women's movement here was just try to change laws that said things like, rape is okay if you do it to your wife. There's no such thing as withholding consent, because by the act of marriage, she has given permanent consent to whatever you want to do to her. And we had to change those laws. And we had to change, even more importantly, the mindset that said, but my wife is my property. So I don't think this model is applicable in the absence of an active women's movement and some pressure coming from whatever within that culture to change. On the other hand, as you saw, there is now a convention on all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW. The United States is one of the only countries, I think with Saudi Arabia, that hasn't signed it. But most countries have signed it, and discrimination includes beating your wife. So most countries have some kind of internal dialogue going on this issue.
Well, Dr. Herman, I am sorry we've run out of time, because we could definitely spend all day talking to you, I think, and I wish we could. Thank you so much for being involved in our conference and presenting to us. It's been fantastic.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes.